Welcome to the Gold Newsletter Podcast, your bank of knowledge of investment, economics, and geopolitics. Go to goldnewsletter.com for our publications and archives.
This is the Gold Newsletter Podcast. Fergus Hodgson, your host. So pleased to be with you. Thanks for tuning in. Please subscribe if you haven't already. SoundCloud, YouTube, wherever you're at, leave us a comment. I would love to get feedback on all these shows, and I appreciate both the snarky comments and the positive ones. So maybe the snarky ones are more entertaining. And we have a repeat guest, one of my favorites. I love to read and hear from independent, provocative thinkers. This man is one of them. Max Borders, welcome back.
Thank you for having me. I always have a blast with you.
Mate, and he is back after a shorter stint. I think it was less than a year since we had him last time. And that's because his new book is out. That is After Collapse, The End of America and the Rebirth of Her Ideals. Literally less than a month ago, it became available. And he is also, so his previous book was The Social Singularity, which I've read and reviewed. Also excellent. And this is somewhat of a sequel. He'll explain that. He's also the director and founder of Social Evolution, which is social-evolution.com, with the mission. This is an NGO with a mission to liberate people and solve problems through innovation rather than politics. Of course, I'm a big supporter of that. Now, this After Collapse, he hinted at it last time we had a chat. Are we already after the collapse? Has it happened?
That is a great question. I think we're at the seeds have been planted, and we are in you might call it the early stages of collapse. Now, I can't say that with any kind of empirical specificity, but I do believe that we are on the front end of an unfolding collapse. How protracted it will be, whether the collapse will happen like a souffle in an oven, sudden and desperate, or if it'll be more like a Japanese economic malaise, I cannot say. But I do think collapse is coming, and I didn't used to be of that mind. I used to have a much more optimistic outlook, but I have seen the antics of our authoritarian leaders, and I have been persuaded that collapse is imminent.
Wow. And it's so strange to hear that, because we see from websites such as Human Progress about the way that things are getting so much better, right? We're living longer, or we're healthier, or we have better access to better medication, whatever. Yet politically, that doesn't seem to be happening. So technology is evolving in a good way, but politics seems to be devolving. And that's, I guess, the whole idea of social evolution, that we're trying to bridge that canyon. Now, her ideals, for people who are not necessarily tuned into American history or values, or maybe they would disagree with you, what ideals are you talking about?
I believe, and your listeners or viewers may disagree, but I believe that fundamentally the United States was founded more or less as a liberal enterprise. And by liberal, I simply mean that freedom lights the way. I do not mean liberal as in as contrasted with conservative. My outlook is neither progressive nor conservative per se. It is rather this general cosmopolitan idea that free people do great things and create anti-fragile societies. This liberal order is one that, imagine the two pincers or the two sides of a vice. And right now that vice is tightening. On one side, you have the Red Guard. On the other side, you have the nationalist authoritarians, and the voice of liberalism is being lost, unfortunately. And the reason I think this is, and this is one of the themes that I relate in the book, and let me just try to explain it for a moment. Your listeners might go, what in the world are you talking about? Okay. But I make the case that there are two basic paradigms. There are actually four, and I can explain it in detail later, but fundamentally two as a masculine paradigm and a feminine paradigm. Okay, the masculine paradigm, if you'll forgive my mouth for a second, is fuck, force, fight. Okay, in other words, the energy that human beings have within us when we respond to fear is that of force. Can be if the masculine paradigm,
overthrow, insurrection. Yeah, okay, sure.
Okay, it doesn't matter how it gets manifested in different ways. It's an urge to control. The urge to control is a masculine paradigm, and we're seeing, and on the one hand, so entrepreneurship and innovation is a system of flow that happens through voluntary interaction. Okay, so that is far less an urge to control, and it depends on that feminine paradigm, which is flirt, fawn, facilitate. That is markets, folks. That is not only markets, but people who are participating in market processes. So the masculine domination or hierarchical paradigm on the one hand, and the feminine paradigm of flow, facilitate on the other are currently at odds. But as we become more fearful due to the pandemic, due to the howls of centralization, we need the government to take over this. We need the government to subsidize that. We need the government to do this and that. This hierarchy is becoming increasingly fragile. And that fragile hierarchy, I believe, not only systemically is going to collapse, but financially has got to. I mean, we're already talking about, again, another quote unquote stimulus on the order of trillions. This is simply mathematically unsustainable. And I'm afraid that control paradigm, that command and control paradigm fueled by debt spending is unsustainable. Now, I have, when people get the cover of the book, they want to focus on the collapse portion and not the after collapse portion, and that's okay. And I'm curious to sort of get your take on that.
Well, first about the collapse element, when I hear of these stimulus packages, these deficits, I want to cry, because Max, I just think it's the end of America. It's the end of the pride and self and resilience of individualism, of federalism, of localism, of resilient communities. I just think we've lost our pride, and I'm obviously an immigrant here, but that's what makes America this distinct nation, in my view. This tough, proud people who take care of each other. And the idea of a federal government in Washington, D.C. having helicopter money, that's the antithesis of this country. I can't believe it.
And so it destroys, it washes away, it ruins all of those virtues and values that you just described. And in fact, that is essentially the first part of the book, is showing all the ways that the centralization of our fears and cares has done to dismantle what is so important about being American in a once liberal order. In other words, an order where we were free to take care of each other, to engage in arrangements of mutual aid, to engage in market processes of the form that wouldn't rely so heavily on debt spending and dependency. But boy, have we abandoned that. And I agree with the human progress folks, by the way, that the world has gotten better. It has gotten better, despite, not because of the centralization. And that's an important point. But what we're doing right now is not sustainable. I do believe, however, that we will continue on the path of human progress if we readopt the very things that you just named, which are systems of mutual aid, federalism, so that we can have a patchwork of experiments that don't fail catastrophically and universally. But that's what we're looking at right now, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Well, your book has just come out. It's fresh off the presses, and I need to get one ASAP. We're at the start of 2021, and yes, we've been in this dystopic COVID-19 scenario. Now, what I'm just trying to piece together, what is your timeline? Do you put any dates in your book, or you just avoid that in terms of?
That's interesting, because there's a fellow named Philip Tetlock who is really good he's a Bayesian thinker. He makes predictions. and he uses different kind of inferential analysis based on very careful predictions, that sort of thing. And I appreciate that. They call them it's foxes versus hedgehogs. Hedgehogs are big theorists, and foxes are the ones who can make pretty accurate predictions using probabilities and so on. I am not a Philip Tetlock, though I admire him, and I say so in the book. I understand that the interplay in the mixed economy right now, that is this sort of debt-fueled hierarchy of interdependency between corporations, the people, and the state, is unsustainable. But the dynamics of that are so complex, I don't think it's easy to put a date certain on it. I think we need to, but we're starting to see signs of it, simply just in inflation more recently. Yes. We're starting to see inflation creep up. Inflation is an early indicator that this could be problematic. And there is some degree of mathematical certainty for a sovereign debt crisis in the future if we don't change our ways. Now, I hold out faint hope that the powers that be, despite all the incentives, will wake up one day and say, okay, this is coming. We need to avoid it. Let's practice austerity and personal responsibility and delegate more power to the states in doing so. But that is, I believe, a very, very faint hope. And in that sense, I preoccupy a lot of myself in the book more with the after the collapse scenarios for how we can reconstitute ourselves, because certainly we can do some things in advance of collapse. The folks who are into precious metals, the folks who are into cryptocurrencies, or whatever your preferred hedge on this behavior of the collusion between the state and the central banks, whatever you want to call this. And I think this is the biggest breakdown, socioeconomic breakdown vector, is that collusion. But however we hedge against that, as people who are worried about this, are going to be the kinds of permanent infrastructure or human systems that we're going to need to make a far more anti-fragile state of affairs after collapse.
Yeah, one of my challenges with your optimistic angle is that we've seen collapses before, right? So other countries have gone through very violent and repressive periods.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily emerge better off after.
Well, and some do, some don't.
Yeah.
And the reason you write a book like this is to say, we don't want to be the ones that don't emerge better off after. Look at some of this can be handled through policy, but some of it cannot. And my hope is that most of it cannot. But there are some governments who saw the writing on the wall. You can take, for example, New Zealand in the early 1980s. Rogernomics saved their butts and made them one of the freest economies in the world. Yeah. And because of that, they're sitting pretty today, but they're being overcome again by the sort of specter of socialism. We'll see how that goes for New Zealand, but certainly the United States is in worse straits. I'm pretty sure more debt relative to GDP ratio, and the political climate here is far more toxic. Even just human civility, one perspective against another, is breaking down to the degree that I don't think there can be fruitful conversations had here. So I'm not as hopeful anymore. And my optimistic outlook is that after collapse, we'll have an opportunity much more readily to self-organize, and we will be forced into a situation in which power is devolved. Otherwise, we're going to be living in some sort of authoritarian regime that is quite unpleasant. But my hope is that won't happen, and that a broke government won't be able to be as authoritarian as one that is flush with debt or cash.
The Gold Newsletter is proudly sponsored by Inventa Capital Corporation, a venture capital advisory firm dedicated to the acquisition and development of assets in the natural resource sector. Today, Inventa is one of the premier mining groups with a first-rate portfolio of companies and a world-class team.
Hi, I'm Brian London, and I'm here with this week's CEO interview with a company in the Inventa Capital Corp group, which is the podcast, the sponsor of the Gold Newsletter podcast. I'm talking this week with Craig Perry, the chairman and founder of Outback Goldfields, symbol OZ, Oz, on the Canadian Stock Exchange. Craig, when last we talked, our audience has been introduced to Outback. I don't know if we were talking about Outback when you and I last talked, but our audience has been introduced to the story. So I guess they're a bit up to speed, but for some of the newbies to the story, can we kind of review what makes Outback such an exciting story and a unique story in that you were able to get this tremendous land position? Can we talk a little bit, kind of set the stage again about what Outback is all about?
Yes, absolutely, Brian. So, for me, the Victorian Goldfields, of course, I think the hottest gold exploration district on the planet today. Of course, Kirkland Lake have their Fosterville mine there that, producing, it's a true tier 1 gold mine, if you like. I think it's the lowest cost large gold mine on the planet. So that really changed the game in that district, the recognition of this new style of mineralization, epizonal type mineralization, as opposed to the historically mined areas. And of course, it's a massive district, 80 million ounces of gold produced over the last 150 years, most of that pre-World War I, actually, that production, and then a hiatus of exploration for many, many years. So, it's a fabulous place to have a large land position. And then for me personally, just before I moved to Canada about 6 years ago, I there's unfinished business in the district, is what I'm trying to say. I was the underbidder to Newmarket for Crocodile Gold's assets. I tried to get money out of New York, and my trajectory, my life would have been very, very different if I'd have managed to pull that off. But Doug and Blaine, of course, beat me to the punch, and then that went into Kirkland Lake, and of course is now the jewel in the crown of Kirkland Lake. So for me, when our deal here, it was an Inventa Capital deal. We some friends of mine were the major shareholders of a company down there in Australia that owned these assets. They brought it to me. They thought, we see the success that companies with ground in this district, companies like Brian Slazarchuk's Fosterville South, are having over in the Canadian market. So they wanted to sort of help to bring things over here. So that's what we did. We put into a shell company that I had there a year ago. We were very fortunate to have Chris Donaldson join us as CEO. Chris was, of course, head of corporate development at Western Copper and Gold, got a tremendous background. I can tell you that he's doing a spectacular job here for us. He's done a remarkable job of getting that deal completed. We raised $11 million back in November, so very well funded. And then he's driving those projects hard, forward very hard. So that's all going well. But just back to that unfinished business. So look, when my friends came to me and said, look, we control a company that has got first mover advantage in this fabulous district, and one of the very biggest land packages in the district, I couldn't let that go past. I've got to this is my chance, or our chance, to put our foot on some great projects and get going. So that's the genesis of Outback.
And you alluded to one aspect of Outback that I think is important, in that because you have a number of properties in this district, and it's amazing that you're able to come in and get these properties well after the land rush had already begun and it was well advanced. But one way that Outback can significantly raise its market value is if one of its neighbors make a discovery, which seems very likely given the terrain, the region, the new understanding of the geology, and the number of companies actively working there. The other more traditional way to do it, of course, is through your own efforts on your own ground. And I see that you've been drilling on the first of those projects, the Glenfine project, for about 3 weeks now, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. Very exciting project. I think, when you do exploration, it's high risk, particularly if you're on a completely greenfield new target. But here we're in the fortunate position that the company that we've acquired this off had already done some drilling. So we're simply following up their very good results. They had results of 3 meters at 10 grams per ton in their last drill program. That hasn't been followed up yet. So we're sat up on that structure and drilling into that same zone to see whether it has any legs to it, whether we can extend it. We're, as you say, we're 2.5, 3 weeks into that process. I think the drill program's going very, very well. And we should be starting to see some results in the not too distant future. So, you hope always that you'll be able to repeat some of those results and turn a few sniffs of mineralization into a deposit. I think we're a good chance there. As you rightly point out, we've got 4 key properties there, and Silver Spoon sits up within 10 kilometres of the Fosterville mine itself. And there's a large auction block going, an auction of a large package of properties that's going on there at the moment. We expect to have an outcome on that in March. That will be interesting because that will sort of re-establish the value of land in the district, and that could be a very big deal. Whoever wins that auction block, we're expecting that they'll need to commit to upwards of $50 million of expenditure commitments over the next few years. So there's going to be a lot of drilling, a lot of work. I think there'll be numerous discoveries made, and that will draw eyeballs back to the district. And it's an exciting time to be in that area. But rest assured, we've got some great projects, and we're drilling on that Yungrin project as we speak. So we should have some results very soon.
Well, actually, you're drilling on Glenfine and the Yungrin project you're doing the geophysical work on too. Let's talk about that a bit, because I thought the geophysical survey has the potential of turning up something very interesting.
Yeah, you're right. Sorry, that's right. We're drilling at Glenfine. Yungrin. Look, Yungrin sits at the northern edge of the district. It's not too far again from the Fosterville mine, on a different structure though that trends through Ballarat. Of course, Ballarat, very important. It produced 16 million ounces of gold. So that big structure that trends through Ballarat trends on into the Yungrin property. Yungrin, there's some regionally significant arsenic anomalies on the eastern end of the property. So we want to get in those. They represent pretty much walk-up drill targets. So we'd like to get those permitted and drilling. I know the guys are out there taking samples over them now. And then on the western part of the property, there's a mixture of outcrop and very shallow cover. So we're doing that geophysical work. We're also, Chris has done a great job on this. I didn't think we would be here at this stage. I thought this would be probably another 6 months away, but we're preparing to also do some roadside RAB drilling. And that very fast to permit. You don't need to do much on the front. And that will give us, either direct targets, so gold and arsenic anomalies, or targets to vector in on and do more work over and start doing more detailed geophysics over those targets that we vector in off that work. So that's all going very, very well. And I think, I would love to see us drilling in the second half of this year. And I think Chris has got us in an excellent position to do that.
Well, Craig, it's very exciting because the land position is tremendous. The fact that you can benefit from other people's work is great, but it's very exciting to see that you're not only very well funded, but you've got drills turning, other important work done. Again, I can't emphasize enough the historic nature of the Victorian Goldfields. There are mines, there are historic mines that were producing at grades that are just mind-boggling. And even some of these historic mines are on your property. So lots to do, and you're doing it now. So some exciting news flow coming up. Craig, thanks again for giving us the update.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'll just leave you with this thought. That Ballarat West property, we're not exploring on that just at the moment, doing some preliminary work. But within 5 kilometres of the property boundary there, Ballarat Gold Mine and a couple of other mines have produced over 16 million ounces in that little area. Our property where we've had outcrop on it has produced over 400,000 ounces. That big structure that hosts Ballarat and parallel structures trend through there. I think it's probably the best place on the planet to find a 5 million ounce gold deposit. And I can't wait for the guys to prove up some targets there and get testing those as well. So look out for that in the not too distant future as well. But thanks, Brian. Always a pleasure to chat.
Great. Thank you, Craig. Good luck on the drilling.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I don't want to get too sidetracked by New Zealand because obviously I grew up in New Zealand, but the peculiar element, which may be hard for Americans to understand right now, is that the people who led the market liberalization, just a very drastic initiative, were actually the Labour Party, so the Workers' Party of New Zealand, not what you'd expect.
The center left or even the left, is that right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Now, in the end, the party basically kicked those reformers out, but at least for the years that they were in power, they were of that party, and they were just pragmatists saying, what do we have to do to get rid of privilege in the economy? Yeah. So, the book is After Collapse: The End of America and the Rebirth of Her Values, and now. It's in part 1 and 2, I guess. The part 1 is the collapse, and the part 2 is the rebirth, which is great. Now, breakdown of our belief in liberalism, breakdown of collective intelligence, breakdown of civil discourse and order, and the breakdown of the federal government. Now, maybe the federal government, as you say, it's not the most important one. It's perhaps the easiest to observe or decipher. So, as we said, we're maybe in this collapsing period. What, aside from a default, would you expect to happen? And can there even be a default when you basically denominate the debts?
Can you rephrase the question?
Can there even, well, what the chapter you have on the breakdown of the federal government in the United States, I think that is probably the easiest for people to understand and observe.
Yes.
Aside from a default, what would this breakdown be? And can there even be a default when the debts are denominated in your own currency?
I don't know the answer to that. I am mostly persuaded by people who are smarter than I on the economics of this, that when you have the dollar as the world reserve currency, that you really it doesn't even make sense to talk about defaulting on it. So
exactly. Yeah.
I call this the times of the devil's fork. And you could think of it as two distinct times, but it would probably be a mix of the two strategies. One would be sovereign default, where you just basically default on paying people back, and you have a sort of government jubilee. And if that's impossible, that might be impossible. So what else can you do but inflate? And then inflation turns into hyperinflation. And there you're paying people back with worthless dollars. That is not good for anyone either. So, however, that there are economists who say that, by the way, that this some sort of negative eventuality like this, similar to Japan's lost decade, its economic malaise, it could look something like Carter's 70s and just be this protracted high inflation state of affairs and then we eventually have to adopt austerity, and that could be a decade or multi-decadal process. I don't know, but that's not good either. But there are economists who are whispering in the ears of power right now, called modern monetary theorists, who say that it's okay. Debt spending is no problem. At the end of the day, it's kind of like, it's almost like magic monetary theory is what I call it.
It's the ultimate have your cake and eat it too policy. Print it and don't pay the bill.
Right. It's like we have so much power, we have so much money, and it's the world's reserve currency. We can do whatever we want, and you can press the balloon from all sides; it'll never pop. And I think it's unfortunate that we've come to this place where every single emergency necessitates either some sort of debt spending or an excuse to grow the size and extent of the state. And I don't mean that as just as an ideologue. I mean that simply in pragmatic terms of that there must be an end to this somewhere. There's got to be some degree of mathematical certainty that there's a point beyond which that this path is unsustainable. And look, there are people like Peter Schiff in the world who've been accused of crying wolf for far too long. And it seems as though the wizards in Washington and in New York have figured out how to use tools in their toolbox to stave off collapse. But how many times can they do that? I mean, right now, the Federal Reserve is running out of money to be able to fix these problems and prop things up. They're already using quantitative easing. Qualitative easing now is a new one. And I'm just not sure that this is sustainable. But I'm relying on better minds than mine to make the collapse prediction on this vector. And, people like economist Anthony Davies.
Okay.
This is, and James Harrigan is his colleague who writes about this stuff as well. These guys are far better economists than I. Just if you think about the debt levels right now, just service on the debt for 1 year is bigger than the entire output of the United States economy. That is just unsustainable.
Okay, I have to push back on that data point. The service you mean on all debts or on because the federal debt, as far as I know, is around, was it 25 trillion now?
25 trillion. 25 trillion, yeah.
And so, but the interest rate's so low that the actual interest servicing costs are around half a trillion, which is not the entire U.S. economy. But yeah.
The it's not service on the debt service versus let me put it another way. You could basically only run the federal government for 9 months if you completely expropriated all of the wealth of all of the billionaires in one stroke. Okay.
Well, yeah, the indebtedness of the U.S. federal government, I think, is there plain for all to see, right? Now, how swiftly or severely that will come into play, whether it'll be, as you said, a protracted Japan-like scenario, that's, it's hard to say. And maybe, as you said, maybe that would not be a good outcome because it wouldn't really stimulate great change. But let's try and finish on an uptick, right? On a positive sentiment.
Yeah.
How do you see this rebirth of American ideals of community spirit, of mutual trade on a local level? Do you see that happening?
I don't see it happening right now to any appreciable degree.
Okay.
And what people end up doing is saying, look, give us more stimulus checks. We're hurting here. Come on, you're supposed to do this, government. And they're making these demands of their politicians, and the politicians have an incentive to respond. Then they have this cabal of modern monetary theorists whispering in their ear saying, this is an emergency. It's okay. It will stimulate the economy to put money in people's hands. Of course.
Yeah. I'm trying to squeeze some good news out of you, Max. Come on. Give me some.
Okay. Well, the good news is once this is no longer sustainable, I don't like to use the term forced to. We will be forced by circumstances to begin to engage in far more readily in creating systems of mutual aid that should have been there all along. In the early 20th century, late 19th century, and all throughout, and beginning in the 18th century, we had systems of mutual aid emerge in the United States before the rise of the welfare state, primarily in the 30s through the 60s, which is really starting with Woodrow Wilson and then ramping up during the Great Depression And then, of course, you had the Great Society programs of the early 1960s. All of these created this basic welfare warfare state model. And I include warfare in that too, because you also have this massive defense spending that is also unsustainable. So we can't just pick on the entitlement programs, which are just transfer schemes.
Agreed.
Transfer schemes aren't transferring as much wealth from the 1% as the transferists, mild, if you want to call it democratic socialists or transfers, like to think, because there's simply no more money left to do that. As I said, if you tried to take the wealth of all the billionaires, you couldn't fund it all. So what we have to do, we're forced by circumstances to start to engage in mutual aid. One in three, I believe, Americans was a member of a mutual aid organization at the turn of the century. This is no longer the case. Most people don't even know what a fraternity is. They think of something as being a college, something that you do in college, Greek week, when you rush and you do keg stands and stuff like that. But fraternal organizations or sororital organizations or mutual aid societies were something that you did every week, just like going to church. Some people did it every day. You had community. You knew the person that you could help. You knew whether or not that, in some sense, whether the aid of the organization would be beneficial to them or not. You would try to create these independent members of the organization who only availed themselves of the community's largesse during emergencies, and that the emergencies were no fault of their own. We don't have this way to monitor each other in systems of mutual aid anymore. We simply we've outsourced it to distant capitals, and with it we've outsourced our virtues and our local knowledge for people in our communities. It's a real shame, but it will have to come back if we enter an era where you can no longer cash these entitlement checks. They'll simply evaporate. They have to.
That's an interesting point, that it's true that the rise of Social Security and all the other welfare programs this has undermined the natural and healthy, as you said, mutual aid societies or associations. I mean, even when I grew up, my father was part of the RSA, which is the Return Services Association in New Zealand, where I still can't believe it, looking back, how much he was involved in the community, just doing volunteer work. And there was also the Catholic Women's League that basically shut down in our town because it was no longer, pertinent to many people. Yeah. So I see that. What about the welfare state? That's obviously a sensitive issue for many people. And the US is a much more militarily oriented country than what I grew up with. Now, the fact is that there is no audit of the Defense Department. There have been unsuccessful attempts to audit the Defense Department. And I've written about this, about how can they expect more money if they can't even, do their accounting. So how on earth is that going to come crashing down?
That I have no idea. And I don't even attempt in the book to anticipate what that looks like. I mean, what I do call for in part 2, which you keep, asking me for, which is what's the light at the end of the tunnel.
Okay, good.
The polycentric state of affairs. It might be a mix of public and private spending, but far more localized and coordinated at scale. Similar to what the Hanseatic League might have had back in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. It is mostly theoretical to think along these lines, but if you have to think of, we want to have freer markets in everything but the defense spending, and defense spending has no rational way of pricing security, then you're going to get bureaucratic growth that is virtually endless. And couple that with the fact that China, for example, is doing the same, and to some lesser degree other countries, quote unquote rogue nations or Russia, then what you have is this destructive arms race to have debt fueled spending on military power that is designed to achieve global dominance, but there's no price system associated with it. You're just you're just pressing the gas on warfare just as much as you're on welfare. So I'm worried about that too. What that looks like in a collapse scenario, though, what our military actually has to do to consolidate its resources and remain intact, I don't know. And I don't think that that's something that one can know, because when you get to a bureaucracy that is so profoundly large, profound in its scope and in its layers of bureaucracy, and the fact that you can't even really adequately audit it.
Right.
I have no idea what a breakdown of that order looks like, but it's frightening, because it could be that when you have all these military assets, but you have no money, that is a situation that is ripe for someone in the highest echelons of power and of the deep state to start to take control. And there might be a jockeying for control in that kind of bureaucracy. When you don't have any more money and you still have military assets, you're dealing then in the currency of power. And that frightens the hell out of me, I have to admit.
One of these trends, do you use the word agorism in your book?
I don't use the word, but the concept is all over the place.
Okay.
So for example, I introduced the reader to two terms that I think we can talk about here that your viewers are going to be familiar with, but not all readers would be, and that is polycentrism and polyarchy.
Okay.
Polycentrism is the idea that you want to break up centers of power so that any failures of a centralized authority aren't catastrophic for the wider order, right? So federalism, polycentricity and federalism are loosely the same concept. Polyarchy, however, is an extension of that. It is the idea that you can have governance that's not attached to territories. So, for example, if I wanted to, just like you have in the Baltic state that has
Estonia.
Yeah, the Estonians have a kind of proto polyarchic situation, which you can avail yourself, even though you're not in the country, of their rules and laws, incorporating there and having citizenship there. That is an early form of polyarchic order where you can join systems of association without being tied to territory, because territorial rules are an artifact of conquest and domination for dominance hierarchies that have predominated in the evolutionary fitness landscape of human history up to this point. But these systems are reaching their limit in a complexity science sense. And I go in deep detail in the book on how these systems are going to start to have to break up in order to be able to survive, or they're going to have to transition to a far more networked state of affairs. And that, in part two, I describe as polyarchy, and a polyarchic order is one where we join associations that may or may not be tied to territory.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. That's plenty to chew on. The book is After Collapse, The End of America and the Rebirth of Her Ideals. And this is by Max Borders, whom we've been speaking with. And his organization, where you can also pick up a copy of this, is social-evolution.com, or Social Evolution. And I just wish you the best with the book and with your continued work. People, you can go to the show notes at goldnewsletter.com/podcast. We'll have links to the book, to Max's work. And actually, is there any issue that I didn't tease out that you got to get out there, mate? Anything left?
Oh, well, I would love to have had a conversation on collective intelligence.
Oh man, well, we'll save that.
But we can do that on another show. And I want to get you the accurate economics data point on the extent of the debt and the problem with an accurate view of the debt, because I think if people want to push back against the claim that we're going to have a collapse, I want to make sure I have that data point correct. So I'll give you that for the show notes.
Okay, go to the show notes, people. Otherwise, Max, best of luck. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, sir. Have a great day.